Today I'm going to be going over all of the books that I read in January. So I read a total of 5 books in January, and without further ado, let's just get started with the first book that I finished in 2021. So the first book that I finished in January is Deep Work: Rules for Focused Success in a Distracted World by Cal Newport. I picked this up personally for my own benefit. I really struggle with focusing on tasks and just being more disciplined whenever I'm working or trying to just get anything done. So I decided to pick this book up to understand, how do I become a better worker and how do I become more focused and disciplined when there's so many distractions in this world. I actually, at the beginning of last year, I read his other book, which is Digital Minimalism. He has many books, but that was the first book that I ever read by him, and I really loved it. And in that book, he talks a lot about social media and how it can be very, distracting. And it's just a general way to get passive entertainment, but you don't really get a lot from it. And this book also goes into social media and how it can be, kind of a time suck. A lot of the activities that we do throughout the days are kind of just passive activities where we're not actually fully engaging our mind and totally getting into the work that we're doing. And I liked this book. I liked the idea of it a lot, and I don't remember really particular things from it, but it's just something that I wanted to learn more about and hopefully will start applying in my life moving forward. If you've never heard of Cal Newport, he's kind of similar to Malcolm Gladwell in the sense that he picks a thesis and then he extrapolates on that thesis. So obviously in this book it was how to stay focused when there's so many things that are vying for our attention. So not only do I want to apply the things that I learned in this book to my professional life, but also when it just comes to my hobbies like reading, I find that I've had a really hard time just sitting down and focusing on a book for extended periods of time. And I think that's just because in the culture we live in today, I'm just so wired to always be thinking about all of these things or stimulus, or there's so many videos to watch on YouTube or things to view on Instagram, and all the things that we're viewing are 10 seconds long to a minute long, and they don't really hold our attention. And I think it's such an important skill that we're losing in society, is just to sit down and focus on what we're doing and not have to be constantly stimulated. So I also want to apply this to my reading and try to get to a point where I can sit down for an hour, 2 hours at a time and just read consecutively. So that's something that I'm going to be trying along the way. But ultimately, I gave this book a 4 out of 5 stars just because I thought it was very useful and I really loved the idea and concept of it, even though I can't really remember the tiny little intricacies of the book. It's also maybe because I listened to it on audio, but it was definitely a very impactful read for me. So the next book that I finished was Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. This is the second Austen novel that I've ever read. The first one was obviously Pride and Prejudice. I know that there's still a lot of Austen that I haven't read yet, but as of right now, I'm just kind of thinking that Jane Austen is not my author. I am not really interested in the Victorian dating scene. I just don't think it's that interesting, but I can see why a lot of people love her books just because they're so witty and beautifully written. Even when I was reading it, I don't know if you can see, but I was tabbing the book just because there were some really beautiful quotes in there. But this book is actually Jane Austen's first novel, but it was published last. It was published with Persuasion at the same time in 1818. But this is a story about Catherine Morland, who I believe is the youngest protagonist in Jane Austen's novel. She's 17 years old. She goes to Bath to basically just socialize with people and try to meet her match, I guess. And she ends up meeting Henry Tilney, and she starts developing feelings and a crush for him. And then later on in the book, she and Tilney go to Northanger Abbey together, which is this gothic home. So for the most part, I thought that this book was pretty slow. I mean, obviously it's not a thriller type book. It is a Jane Austen novel that's focused on romance and whatnot. The book really focuses on how naive the main character is. She is 17 years old, as I've said, and she kind of just likes to think about dancing and fashion, and she reads a lot of fluffy romance novels. And because of that immaturity, you can see how that translates in how she interacts with other people and with her crush. And this is really a kind of a coming of age novel where she's trying to step outside of that innocent, immature personality and like grow into herself more and become a more mature woman. I did like how this book touched on how the romance novels at the time really influenced the way that she thought about romance and relationships, and how she really thought that the things that she read in books were factual to what happens in real life, because this is something that I think about a lot today, which is how movies, media, or books influences the way that I think, and also can kind of give me a misconception about how things actually happen in the world. And it was really interesting to see her touch on that. And also it's kind of interesting how people that read books back then were kind of seen as lesser than. I just don't think books were as highly thought of as they are today as like a hobby. But ultimately, I thought the book was okay. I actually thought the book got a little bit better once they actually got to Northanger Abbey and she was starting to learn more about Henry Tilney's family and history, and then there was a little bit more drama. I just wish that this book had way more drama than it did, and it wrapped up real quick. Like 15 pages to the end, I was like, how is this gonna end? And then it just like was over. So yeah, not my favorite book of all time. Also, I just think this copy is so ugly. I'm sorry. I usually love mass market paperbacks, but I really don't like this book. Anyway, I'm just gonna give this book a 3 out of 5 stars. It's not terrible. It's an Austen novel. How can I possibly judge Austen? But I just don't think she is my personal favorite as an author. So the next book that I finished in January was The Shining by Stephen King. I absolutely love this book so much. I have a whole reading vlog about it, so I'm not going to get too much into like my thoughts just because I spent that whole reading vlog talking about my thoughts. But basically this book is about Jack Torrance, who was laid off at his former job. He struggles with alcoholism, and he decides to take a job as a caretaker for the Overlook Hotel on its off season. So him with his wife Wendy and his son Danny, who is 5 years old, go to the Overlook Hotel to stay there. And while they're there, the Overlook Hotel kind of messes with them. So while they're at the Overlook Hotel, there's all of these strange forces and paranormal things that are happening, and the only one to notice them is Danny. And I'm not going to get much more into the plot just because I'm sure a lot of you guys are already familiar with The Shining or have seen the movie, which I actually have not yet seen. But I love this book so much. So the characters, I just felt like were so well developed. I love Jack Torrance's character, and it's such a psychological thriller in the sense that we really see his downfall and how he falls into madness. And then also I think that Wendy and Danny are also very well developed characters. This book is definitely really fast paced and reads like a thriller, and there's all these crazy things happening, and I just think it's so interesting. King just makes things like paranormal you think you can't actually relate to because it's so like outworldly, but I feel like he writes it in a way where you can actually see these things happening. And I am so glad that I ended up picking up this book. It reignited my passion for King, and I'm planning on reading a lot more Stephen King to come in 2021. But ultimately, this book was definitely a 5 out of 5 stars. Also, I don't know if you guys saw my reading goals for 2021, but my 2 goals are to read more classics and also to read more longer books. So in January, I wanted to get a head start on those goals. So obviously Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen is going to be considered a classic, and then Stephen King is considered a longer book because it is pretty thick, even though it does read like a thriller, so I feel like it does go by pretty fast. But just wanted to let you know that these are also accomplishing some of my goals that I set out this year. So the next 2 books that I read in January were actually rereads for me. So I listened to More Than Words by Jill Santopolo on audio. I actually read this book a couple years ago, but I was in a huge reading slump when I read it, and I always told myself that I wanted to reread it again. So Jill Santopolo writes The Light We Lost, which is like one of my favorite books of all time. And this book is definitely follows similar things to The Light We Lost, but it's a very different story. So this book is basically about Nina Gregory, who is the daughter of like New York City's like hotel owner and this very wealthy businessman. So this book is basically a romance novel, I'd say, or a love story. So Nina is dating Tim, which was her childhood like best friend, and they've been dating, and he's like a very sweet and kind person. And then once her father dies, she starts learning about all of these things about her dad that weren't necessarily what she knew of him, and a lot of these things were coming out, and it was just changing her perspective on her father and like the way that she wanted to live her own life. There was always this expectation put on her that she was going to rug the Gregory Corporation after her father died, but she currently has a job writing speeches for this candidate named Raphael, who is running to be the mayor of New York City. So after her dad dies, she starts to view her relationship with Tim differently, and then she starts developing feelings for her boss. And yeah, so it's definitely like very love triangle-y, which for some reason Jill's anthropologist like loves to do love triangles. So when I first read this book, I think I gave it like a 4 out of 5 stars, and then when I reread it, I don't think I loved it as much. I think I obviously like The Light We Lost better, even though like there's so many issues with it. I just don't think that either The Light We Lost or More Than Words really represent healthy relationships. I think this book for me is going to be more like a 3 out of 5 stars. I think it's like a solid like romance set in New York City. It's like very New York-y, but it's not like my favorite book ever. So yeah, kind of average for me. She does have a book coming out in March, so I'm really excited for that, and I'm really hoping it kind of like breaks the themes of like these unhealthy relationships in love triangles, but we'll see. But yeah, that was More Than Words by Jill Santopalo. So the last book that I finished in January, as I said, is a reread, and that is This Love Story Will Self-Destruct by Leslie Cohen. I know that I talk about this book a lot on my channel. This was the 3rd time that I read this book, and I was just like really in the mood for a feel-good. Like I just wanted to get back into the story, and every time I reread it, I just love it more and more. So this book is told in dual perspectives, Eve and Ben. Eve is like a dreamer and a feeler, and she is a writer for her profession. And then Ben is an engineer, so he's more organized and like structure. And it just talks about like how different their personalities are and how they bring them together. And it's just like it's just a really good feel good for me. I mean, I love this book so much, and I think I like this book a lot because this is the only book that I've read where I feel like I can really identify with the main character. I feel like me and the main character are so similar, and I haven't read any other book where I felt that way. I think that not only is my personality really similar to the main character, but also just the life experiences that she's had, and especially with her career and how she kind of exists in the world and handles life is just so relatable to me. Also, this book, if you want to know what living in New York City is actually like, this book really gives you an exact idea of what that is. I mean, I think that a lot of books really glamorize New York City and make it like this very romantic and amazing place, but anyone who's lived in New York knows that it can really like beat you down, and there's a lot of glamour, but there's also a lot of like hardship living in the city, and this book just like really goes into that too. And this book is just like a feel good for me, and it's hard to recommend this book just because I know that this book identifies with me, which is why I love it so much, and it's obviously a 5 out of 5 stars. But I just really hope that you're able to find a book where you can identify with the main character, whatever that book is. And when I say identify, I mean just finding someone who you feel like gets you and thinks like you and exists in the world like you. I just feel like that's so hard to find in books, and when you do, it's just like such an amazing experience. If you have a book like that, leave it down in the comments below if you feel like you can really identify with the main character. But this book just means a lot to me, and I would honestly reread it every month if I could, but I might table it for now and pick it up in a few months. But I absolutely love this book so much. So those were the 5 books that I read in the month of January. Please let me know what your favorite and least favorite book in January was. I'd say that, so that's hard because my favorite book is This Love Story Will Self-Destruct, obviously just because I reread it because it's one of my favorite books. And then obviously The Shining is one of my favorite books of the month because I've never read that before and it totally blew my mind. Least favorite book is definitely going to be Northanger Abbey, and then the other 2 were kind of just like good or average. Thank you so much for getting all the way till the end of this video. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you guys in the next one.